My name's Ava Lee and I'm a senior campaigner at Global Witness. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are an NGO that seeks to break the links between corruption, natural resource abuse, environmental damage and human rights abuses. We use investigative journalism to uncover the truth, and then we campaign off of the back of that. We push for policy change and legal accountability. And our work takes us all over the world, from the rainforests in Papua New Guinea to illegal mines in Myanmar, huge corruption scandals in Brazil, and we normally end up back here in London. We follow the money and it usually takes us here, somewhere a little more glamorous sounding like the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands. We first started to get wind of the 1MDB scandal when we were looking at Sarawak and illegal land grabs and deforestation a few years ago, and that was when we first came into contact with Clare. A couple of years ago we released a report called The Real Wolves of Wall Street that looked at the role that lawyers, accountants and auditors were playing in this huge scandal that we're going to talk about a little bit more. But a lot has changed in the last 12 months, and it will be really great to hear more about that from Bradley and Clare. Just before I introduce the panellists, a couple of housekeeping things. The toilets are directly behind you, and the fire escape is that way as well. We don't have a planned fire alarm, so if you hear a fire alarm, do leave the building. We're going to be filming tonight. If anyone would prefer not to be on film, just come and speak to Jasmine and she can make sure that that happens. Please do tweet. We're using the hashtag 1MDB, but we'd ask that you take as many photographs as you like, but please don't film. Okay, that's enough from me. Oh, and the most important bit is we've got pizza being delivered at 8, so stay and have some food and chat with us then. Okay, so now over to my fantastic panellists. We have Bradley Hope from the Wall Street Journal, and this event is very much in honour of the brilliant book that he has just released with Tom Wright, who's also from the Wall Street Journal. $1 Billion Whale, which is already a New York Times bestseller, but unfortunately isn't on the bookshelves in the UK yet, and we'll be talking a bit more about why. Bradley's a Pulitzer finalist, and before coming to the Wall Street Journal, covered the Arab Spring for the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. And then we have Clare Rewcastle Brown, who was key in breaking the 1MDB story. Born in Sarawak, she was campaigning tirelessly for a really long time to protect the rainforest there, and also has a huge number of awards, including the Guardian Award for, sorry, is this feedback quite bad? It's okay. Including the Guardian Award for reporting on fraud. In 2016, Clare was named on the Fortune list of the world's most influential people, and then in 2016 Malaysia issued a warrant for her arrest and requested that she was put on the Interpol International Red Notice, which they thankfully declined. In 2018, after Najib lost his seat, Malaysia rescinded the warrant, and so we're pleased that we have her to join us here today. And then finally we have Rebecca Vincent from the UK Bureau of Reporters Without Borders. She's a fantastic American-British human rights campaigner, a former diplomat who specialised in Azerbaijan, where she was campaigning for a number of years, particularly around kind of freedom of expression issues. Not too dissimilar to Clare, Rebecca also has been banned from Azerbaijan at points in her life and has continued to really hold the government to account for their actions against journalists and human rights defenders more broadly. So, over to Bradley. It would be great, I'm sure lots of the audience are unfamiliar with the 1MDB scandal. If you could give us a bit of a breakdown and tell us who the key players are and what happened.
Yeah, well, it's one of the kind of unfortunate truths of journalism that most corruption stories are actually not that interesting. You know, you don't usually get to find out something that really illuminates how the world really works. A lot of times it can be unsatisfying. You know, even to some degree, the Panama Papers, it sometimes felt like a huge amount of information, but kind of shallow. You don't really know where the money came from, what it's being used for. But in 1MDB, it's kind of the opposite problem. It's one deep scandal that reveals how the world really works. And it's not just these kind of obscure offshore operators. You're talking about all the major banks, Goldman Sachs, the heart of Goldman Sachs, major law firms, all of the auditors, Hollywood, and the whole industry of funding films. And it crisscrosses the globe as well. You know, it goes from Malaysia to New York to Hong Kong. Literally, there's no jurisdiction that doesn't have some sort of connection. And in fact, here in London, we're hoping I spoke to Oliver Bullough, one of our colleagues, about adding to the kleptocracy tour. There's two pieces of real estate in particular in London, right off of Green Park Station. There's a full floor penthouse, and then just down the road an office building that were all bought with the stolen money from 1MDB. So what is a scandal? So basically in Malaysia there was a prime minister called Najib Razak who was in desperate need of funds to continue his electoral gains in the elections, and he kind of collided with this young Malaysian, I guess we can call him now kind of a fraudster. I mean, we used to call him a financier, but it seems a bit generous. So this young guy, he never had a real job in his life. He never worked at a bank or in any kind of institution. Everything he did was things of his own creation. He was a classic sort of wheeler-dealer type. He went to Harrow, and what he was a connections guy. And I wouldn't call him anything good at anything else than that, really. And just a good connections guy and a good teller of tales. So with Najib, he from scratch created a sovereign wealth fund. Usually sovereign wealth funds, you think of these big institutions with billions of dollars from oil revenues, the savings of a country, but this was different. This was a fund that had 1 million ringgit as its starting capital, and every other dollar that it had was borrowed. Borrowed from banks, borrowed through Goldman Sachs, through bond offerings, and essentially, over a period of a few years, they stole upwards of $6 billion from this fund through a variety of schemes. The first one that Claire totally uncovered. And that money was used to go on one of the world's greatest spending sprees that we've ever seen. Maybe it'll be like one of the last great spending sprees, because it takes a unique character to spend money the way he was spending it. I remember there's one description in one of the Justice Department documents about spending I think $85 million on sort of sundries over the course of 5 months. Not a single asset is bought with that money. That's just sort of operating expenses for him and his crew. And it's been a colorful tale from the beginning. And actually one of the first publications that really covered it well was the New York Post Page 6 crew, which is kind of the gossip group at the New York Post. They wrote this extremely prescient article about this young Malaysian guy showing up at nightclubs, dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single night, staying in a suite of apartments, and they said, nobody spends their own money like that. So it turned out to be exactly right. All along the way, there was red flags, for many people to pick up on, but while the money was flowing, nobody really wanted to push too hard. And thanks to Claire and a lot of other journalism, the whole scandal came to a kind of a cataclysmic crash in 2015 when the fund itself became unsustainable. 1MDB, it had so much debt and not enough new debt to pay off the old debt interest payments. Combined with some of these exposés that showed it had been stolen, and one of the biggest exposés was there was a direct money trail into the Prime Minister's personal bank account. It wasn't even a kind of sophisticated operation. He had a bank account in Malaysia under his name, and it received $1 billion, and that money was used for, I'd say primarily electioneering, but also a few other sundries, like a couple of $100,000 at Chanel in Hawaii while they were meeting Obama, maybe potentially for a gift for the first family, but and some luxury cars and things like that. But,
a few diamonds.
Yeah, a few diamonds, but no, that's not from the billion, but from other flows of money. And well, sort of fast forward to last year, this scandal finally reached its crescendo. The Prime Minister, in a shock to everyone, to be honest, was voted out of office, the first thing they did was sort of go into the Prime Minister's house, and they found a sort of extraordinary haul, and I think it was something like 14,000 pieces of jewelry belonging to the First Lady, hundreds, I think more than 400 handbags, almost all of them Birkin bags. But the one detail that always struck me was, I think there was about 14 tiaras, and I just think that's just too many tiaras. They found a lot of cash, and anyway, so that's, long story short, and what we've seen recently, so forget Goldman Sachs, there's an indictment a few days ago about Jolo getting money into the Obama campaign. There's evidence now that it's not evidence, that he's hired in his defense all of Trump's lawyers, essentially. He hired Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, Mark Kasowitz, Trump's personal lawyer, Bobby Bergfield, the ethics lawyer, and so on. So, this is a guy that has an incredibly, amazingly cynical view of the world. But if we kind of watch how he behaved and how he behaved in the scandal, we get a sense of our own naivety, that we thought things worked this way, but actually, Jolo can show us, he's our greatest teacher in a sense, of how things really work and how flows of money can course across the world without anyone stopping it. Billions of dollars. If you try to transfer $10,000, you get asked all kinds of questions. But if it's billions, nobody asks any questions. So
Bradley, your book is really sadly not available here. Can you tell us a bit about why that's the case?
Yes. So of course I should mention that Jolo denies all charges. When we were preparing this book, we of course, in our classic journalistic tradition, went to Jolo's people, his lawyers, and said, here's what we're going to say, we'd love to get your side of the story, here are all of the facts that we're planning to include. They declined to respond, they declined to even confirm his age. So then fast forward to almost a year later when our book was about to come out, they opted for a strategy of threatening bookstores across the English-speaking world. So all across the UK, including some small bookstores in London, they received special letters just to them, saying, if you happen to sell this book that's coming out on this date, we will be suing you as well for participating in the defamation of our client. In other places like Hong Kong, one of my favorite anecdotes is the Hong Kong airport bookstore. They were obsessed with this bookstore. They were delivering letters to this bookstore every few hours. At one point, post-publication, they were saying, you are continuing to defy our orders, and they kept hitting them with this letter. So as a result, all of the UK publishers, who you need you need a distributor, you don't even need someone to buy the rights, but you need someone to distribute it in the UK, they all sort of declined. As far as I can tell, almost every bookstore declined to carry it, although it has been cited. I won't say where, in case there's any children's representatives here who would go directly to that bookstore, but so that's why. But we're hopeful that when we were putting our book together, it was a different world. Najib was still the prime minister. There weren't criminal indictments against everybody in many jurisdictions. Interpol red notices for Jolo instead of Clare. So now we're hoping that we'll come out later this year. But we'll see.
And if there are any representatives from any of those law firms, we'd really love to say hi. So do come.
I did see it in a bookshop on Monday, Thursday. Quite a few copies. If they've gone now, it'd be interesting to find out if that's because they've been withdrawn or they've been sold. Hopefully the latter. I suspect the publisher may have been saying, to hell, let's go ahead.
We'll come and find you and find where that bookshop is later. So Claire, you were at the very beginning of breaking this story, and you received considerable threats yourself. Can you take us back to that time and describe what that experience was like for you and your family?
Yeah, well, I was coming from a position of what corruption does. The whole story that Bradley has been talking about. What does this do? And that's what Global Witness is about. And that's what I was doing in Sarawak. Because there was no reporting about it. These crooks and their allies who were in control of the Malaysian government at that time and had become so lazy and blatant and because they were getting away with so much that they were running these sorts of bank accounts that we were talking about. They took out a jungle. They took out the third largest jungle in the world, and that is that is something of an enormous concern to all of us, and I think we're all waking up to the importance of that. But at the time, I was sort of reporting this with the awareness that these sorts of things were being ignored despite the immense sums of money that we were talking about. Billions and billions of dollars worth of timber and land and oil palm concessions were being corruptly siphoned through the pockets of just a handful of politically powerful people in Malaysia. And there's been a widespread tendency to ignore these sorts of issues. You talked about a naivety. It's a naivety on our part, combined with, I think, an appalling cynicism on the part of so many professionals and financial institutions who were involved in assisting these kleptocrats in removing their vast stolen wealth from the scene of the crime, and Azerbaijan is another example, into the City of London and other such places. And it was very obvious to me that banks, reputable banks, were involved all along the way in making this possible. And so I started, reporting about timber corruption, and often sort of did, find myself working together on stories and so on with organisations like Global Witness, and did a great deal of exposés actually until it became obvious to me that Najib Razak could come in as a reforming prime minister. He was a public school boy as well. It's not just Joe Low, and he played this very suave, liberal kind of a guy, really took in a lot of people who thought that he was going to reform a lot of this corruption. But he obviously did the exact opposite, and he certainly wasn't picking up on any of the corruption that I'd unveiled. I started to look at the wider problem, the problem that was Malaysia, and also the international problem. You mentioned the Panama Papers and all of this. No one was calling out the secrecy of offshore sufficiently. And even if you get a number of companies or information such as the Panama Papers, what you're not getting is the actual stories. And that's what's so rare about 1MDB, that I was able to get from the grassroots up story of how the offshore system, we can all tell, of course the offshore system is abused in this way. I mean, what a wonderful instrument. Of course it's going to be abused. But we allowed it to go on and, explode into an enormous industry, an enormous, proportion of the global wealth is now hidden away from the normal jurisdictions that you and I have to abide by, using this secrecy. And 1MDB was my chance. So once I had, the story was, I'd been trying to avoid getting involved in Malaysia, but it was, we're journalists, and as Bradley says, one of the joys of 1MDB in terms of bringing this whole issue to people's attention was just how, lively it is, and how exotic and outrageous these ostentatious thieves were, who were all in their early 20s and, totally really without restraint. And it was when I realized from a tip-off in late 2013, when this top Hollywood movie was coming out, Wolf of Wall Street, all about excess and theft and the spending of stolen money in grotesque ways. I learned that it was being produced and financed by the son of Najib Razak, this prime minister I'd become very suspicious of. Again, there's not enough reporting about plain sight corruption. This was something wrong in plain sight. And so that's when I first did the story, just drawing out the connections. How come, could you please answer whatever? An article full of questions. And I got a barrage of replies in the form of legal letters. And that was the beginning of my adventure of dealing with the real powers that be globally. Lawyers, private investigators, people who want to frighten you, people who want to vilify you using fake news sites, big-time PR agencies, all of whom are, working off multi-million-dollar budgets to go after a penniless journalist who's just pointed out an obvious truth. So I can talk about that a little bit later, maybe, if we want to come back to it.
So Rebecca, how typical is the story that Clare experienced, that Bradley's experiencing now?
I think far too typical, and really this is just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is that actually we have very little information about the true scale of this. Perhaps to take a step back though and put it into the broader context, we work on press freedom, and so to us this is a press freedom issue. It has never been a more deadly time to be a journalist, right? Last year, we know of 80 cases of journalists murdered in the world. So far this year, there have been 14 already in 2019. That's journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers as well. When we look at the 2018 figures, an alarming 69% of those killed were actually deliberately targeted. So the other 31% were killed in the course of doing their jobs in the field, but many of those that were deliberately targeted were investigative journalists working on this exact sort of thing, working to expose corruption. Increasingly, we're seeing these people at a tremendous amount of risk in countries around the world. It's not just in Malaysia, this is happening in too many places, but it often takes something really extreme for us as a global community to get information about what's really happening. Malta is a very good example, because there it literally took the assassination of a journalist by a car bomb in broad daylight to draw attention to this very issue. So Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed in October 2017. She was, again, a journalist exposing corruption, in fact, the country's most prominent journalist. She had received numerous threats, including some from the same London law firms that are often being discussed in Malaysia and other cases as well, but refused to be silenced, and actually that cost her life. But what that shed light on was the fact that many other media outlets in the same country had received these letters, had received these threats, and had complied, which left her at tremendous risk. And so that's a story really to be drawn from this is it can be quite deadly consequences. It's not just a matter of legal threats, and too often it is the same 5 or 6 firms here in London that are popping up in too many parts of the world. Too often also it is left to the individual journalists to face this risk alone, to champion these causes. Too often it's people like Daphne Caruana Galizia or like Clare who get stuck into it as a matter of principle, who don't actually have the resources to fight it, but they fight it anyways, and they bring this to light. I think too often the big media outlets are simply complying with these requests. If you attempt to research this, and I want to say actually it's been referred to for a long time as SLAP, right? This is a bit jargony, strategic lawsuits against public participation. So lawyers have been talking about this for quite some time, but the public hasn't really been aware. And actually it's very new that this is even being recognized as a press freedom issue. But what it is misuse of defamation law, abuse of defamation law. So it's come to this, that it no longer even requires legal action to censor the press, to silence critical journalists. Just the threat of it is often enough. That has a serious chilling effect, not just in the countries where this is taking place, but everywhere. When they make examples of people like Clare, of people like Daphne Caruana Galizia, the message is heard loud and clear, and too often that's leading to very easy compliance with these requests. So when you attempt to research it, media outlets actually don't often even want to talk about openly the fact that this is happening. Perhaps they don't want to acknowledge that they've complied with these requests, or sometimes there's settlements that preclude them from discussing this. It often ends up being the courageous individual that does want to force it to the light. And too often these individuals are at risk. So that's what we need to do better actually here in the UK and as an international community, is finding ways to protect people who are taking on these risks, and maybe better solidarity among the media community too, in exposing this for what it is and taking it head on.
Well, I could talk a little bit about the experience I had, because it was those first 6 months actually when I, having sort of kind of sniffed the original story and fought off the original lawsuits, I just started digging into 1MDB and picking out stories until eventually, when you do that, people come to you, you hear about stuff, and after about 6 months, I picked up on some vital data, which was that there was a whistleblower who had worked with the first joint venture partner, so-called. It was all a scam. Had a fancy name. It was called Petra Saudi. And oh my goodness, I'm sure they've got lawyers in here too. I've had enough of them after me. But anyway, Petra Saudi was a London-based company and also Swiss-based that had a supposed joint venture with 1MDB. And they siphoned out the first 1.83 billion, and most of that went into companies that were actually owned by Joe Low. So when I got the database from this whistleblower and did the original story, that was my moment of maximum exposure. There was a major newspaper here that had some brilliant journalists who were really excited by the story. They got, I think, 6 separate law firms onto them, hammering them down from the moment they sent out their, the letters that they had to send out to advise who they were writing about. And that was a massive pushback against their publication, extremely expensive for them. Classic example. They did put out a story, but that's the last time they pretty much covered this story. And that left me on my own. Nobody else. Every other journalist who thought about covering the story, every other news organization would have to go through the ritual of contacting the people we were writing about, and they would immediately get this, this hugely funded pushback, and they weren't covering it. Only me. So I'm going through all the database, bringing out these glorious scoops, but they identified me as the problem. And for about 6 months, their scheme was to destroy me and my credibility. They managed to get my whistleblower arrested in Thailand, where they were paid people to set him up. It was an extraordinary operation. I mean, they hired a whole lot of British operatives, including an ex-GCHQ senior director, an ex-SAS guy, an ex-metropolitan policeman. These guys were all pulled in, all their professional skills pulled in to go and, kind of get hold of this guy in Thailand and get a whole confession out of him that I was a master forger, I was a liar, I was politically motivated, and all these things were being written about me in the letters that were being sent by the law firms to other media, and then to basically say, that it was a hoax. And in the meantime, while that was going on, my source is in jail. They're hacking my computer. They're following me around. So I suddenly realize everywhere I go, there's a sort of crew-cutted guy sitting a bit near, trying to intimidate me, trying to shut me up. And of course, a massive PR effort. I mean, they made me famous, or they made me notorious, because suddenly the social media is bursting with negative stuff about me, with websites devoted to what a scam artist I am. And vilifying me in every possible way. And I felt very isolated, but of course I realized, that one thing they weren't actually doing at that stage was bringing a lawsuit against me because I had such strong evidence. But until I was able to, really progress that, that was a very, very vulnerable situation for a journalist to be in. And the mainstream media were really not coming in. It was only when I got the next stage of the story, which was the Najib bank account material, and I worked with the Wall Street Journal, we pushed that into a whole new level, and it got into, and we also got the FBI and DOJ onto it, that we started to be able to push back from that situation. They definitely thought if they could destroy me, then that was their tactic. Then they could kill the story.
Obviously, Joe Lowe isn't here to defend himself, but if you'd like to hear what he said, he wrote quite an amazing blog where he describes all of Bradley's book as gossip, which I think is quite unusual for Wall Street Journal's work to be described as gossip. But you can go and have a look at that there if you want to hear what he has to say about all of this. I think the PR side is really interesting. It was reported a couple of weeks ago that Joe Lowe has now spent over $1 million in PR, and that's just in the last 2 years. So in his own PR, and we don't know who or how much was spent on the kind of shady PR tactics that were used against you.
I saw one contract given to a British company here called FBC Media. They were given a $15 million contract to deconstruct me in the Sarawak issue. That's just one.
I think in terms of the kind of 1MDB scandal more broadly and the way that Joe Lowe appears to have been operating, his reputation and his image was always clearly really important to him from right at the beginning before he was even sort of engaged in this at school. Bradley, could you tell us anything more about that, the kind of celebrity world that you tried to engage in?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, Joe Lowe is in the trouble he's in because he was a bit clumsy. I mean, there's these leaked emails where people were saying, why does this guy keep going to a nightclub and spending $1 million and shouting, Malaysia in the house? They're like, just stop saying that in the clubs, Stop having New York Post articles written about you. And he made so many mistakes. I mean, he did a big interview at one point with a publication in Europe. I'm forgetting what it's called, but I later learned he thought the conversation was on background, but it turned out it was on record, and the whole thing was sort of published. And he also changed his story publicly so many times. So at first he would say, oh, no, I'm just the concierge to the ultra-rich. You know, the people spending the money at the club were my wealthy friends from the Middle East. Later on, he started saying, no, actually, I'm a billionaire. I've always been a billionaire. Third generation. You know, my grandfather, he has some mines, and it was just so inconsistent. You know, but it hasn't stopped him from trying to kind of put the genie back in the bottle. I just think, in a way, that just going back to the kind of tragic flaw, I think he was always in such a hurry. He was so desperate. He was kind of running away from all of the problems he had set up that really undermined him. But, you know, he tried everything in the book. Digital kind of experts to kind of scrub the internet, many PR firms on many million-dollar contracts, these legal tactics. I just think in his case, he had just been so clumsy that there was no chance it was going to work, you know. And also, he had no story to tell. So there's never been any kind of an argument put forward by Jho Low about how is it that you came by all these transactions. I mean, if you read the Justice Department legal filings, which are very voluminous, they are just devastating. I mean, there's no way around them, you know.
Can we talk a bit more about the Justice Department now, and particularly what's going on with Goldman Sachs, because it appears quite unprecedented?
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure Claire will agree, the Justice Department in the U.S. is definitely leading the way on this case. And it's become such a sprawling case because there's the Public Integrity Unit, which deal with corruption in D.C. They're handling things like this money that went to politics. There's a whole, you know, you know, I kept thinking 1MDB was kind of like winding down, and then one day landed in our laps this story about how Jho Low was transferring millions of dollars to this top Trump fundraiser who was trying to lobby the Justice Department to drop the case, and it was just so incredible. You know, we couldn't believe it that he was trying this stuff. So because of his, he's so busy, you know, there's so many different parts of law enforcement that are pursuing it. So you have those guys doing corruption, you have the people in Brooklyn that are doing the overall fraud. There's a whole case looking at Goldman Sachs. You know, it hasn't yet reached a kind of settlement, but analysts are saying it's going to be many billions of dollars settlement from Goldman Sachs. And ironically, if the fine is high enough, and if they give enough of it to Malaysia, it may be that at the end of the day, Goldman Sachs foots the bill for the whole thing, which will be quite interesting. And that's just the U.S. I mean, there's probably everywhere in the world except the UK are pursuing this case. There's a lot of stuff in Switzerland. Malaysia's got many. I mean, they've brought, I would say, dozens of cases against the prime minister and all of his people. Singapore, Luxembourg, you know, Hong Kong.
Yeah. Why not the UK?
Well, maybe I don't know the answer, so I won't say I know the answer.
I can tell you the answer they gave me, because I went round. I gave all this information to the Swiss, and then I gave it to the FBI. I gave it to the UK, and they said, oh, well, we've had a lot of cutbacks after the financial crash. So our resources for investigating have almost disappeared entirely.
Yeah, I mean,
what a wonderful way to deal with a financial fraud that brought the economy down.
One sort of startling statistic would be, I was told recently that the annual budget of the National Crime Agency for international corruption is approximately £1 million. So you can imagine, and I think it's sort of starting to come out, that the DOJ's case is costing them many millions of dollars. I mean, they will, if these cases succeed, they will recover that money. But I mean, you have to spend tens of millions of dollars to take down a $6 billion scandal. But you can't just spend a few $100,000 on it. So I think that's a big part of it.
And what's happening in Malaysia now, Claire? Maybe you can speak to that.
Well, I'm actually going to Kuala Lumpur tomorrow, and I may be sort of taking the opportunity to stick my nose in to the trial that's going on underway now. 42 charges, I think, are now standing against the former Prime Minister. And again, it's just such an extraordinary thing because, again, we're just not dealing with these issues. The world had decided that this kleptocrat was too powerful and that he would be able to control the election. and they still had this sort of, I mean, it was a sham election, everyone assumed, because, you know, the government had never been got out since independence. It was that controlled. But because of the reporting, because we'd got through to every single person in Malaysia by, thankfully, even though, you know, I'd been banned off the internet, you know, the internet was still getting this information through. There was this tsunami that overturned that government, and that's the power of reporting. If you do it, if you're able to do it, and then everything's unraveled. But you know, Britain was still doing business with these guys right up to the end, you know, as were nearly all the countries, because they thought that Malaysia was a fixture and nobody was speaking out against. And again, you know, all these banks, the reason they were so blatant and insouciant was because the banks were prepared to assist them in transferring these huge sums of money. AM Bank, where the Prime Minister had his bank account in KL, was the biggest shareholder was ANZ Bank of Australia, and all the top personnel in that bank were Australian citizens on secondment from the big bank. You know, and this is hopefully by at least getting this one scandal banged to rights, and thank goodness the DOJ are taking it very seriously, we will make the point. I mean, dozens of banks have been caught up in this, fined, exposed for negligent and criminal behavior. And Goldman Sachs is the big one. They're in a very, very exposed position over this. Hopefully, you know, we will use this lesson to force change in the way that these banks have been willing to transfer these stolen amounts of money. But over in Malaysia, you know, it's just, you know, it's been an absolute shock to the country, really, to experience the betrayal. Of course, they get, you know, one story from their own side. I mean, there was a massive amount of fake news propaganda, except that it was saying that I was the one telling the lies and the DOJ were the ones telling the lies. So very, very tough for a public to assess all this when you have your own government pouring money into misinformation. You know, Malaysians are pretty smart, and they worked it out. But it's for that country, it's been an existential experience, and they're still going through it.
So much of the investigative reporting on this was really done from outside of Malaysia. So your radio station was based from your kitchen, I believe, in London. You were working for the Wall Street Journal, also here in London. What's the situation on the ground like for journalists working in Malaysia now?
I mean, it's got a pretty poor press freedom climate. I believe they're 123rd out of 180 countries in our World Press Freedom Index. I think the pressures really are more systemic. You don't see blatant examples, for example, of journalists jailed there. It's not a country where that's the issue. But it's all this climate, and it's why the journalists are having to take up these risky stories from abroad and still facing actually serious repercussions here.